We have completed several lectures, and today we are here. John Calvin, 1509 to 1564. John Calvin and the Protestant Reformation in Geneva. Particularly, he is familiar for institutionalizing the Protestantism. Protestant Christianity started slowly moving from one nation to another nation, and slowly people started grasping the revolutionary ideas, started reading, reflecting, but it was John Calvin who made it a kind of institutionalized the Protestant Christianity because of his theology and because of his great charismatic character and the contribution to the church. The spread of Protestantism. Protestantism spread rapidly in the early 16th century, as we have been discussing that. It grew strong in Northern Europe, particularly this Northern Germany, Scandinavia, Netherlands, and England. We have, what happened is, one second. No, why this? Right, please come back. So the Protestantism spread through this Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, and England. We have looked at the other day how the Protestant ideology started spreading in the minds of the people and the king and several other people, particularly in Germany. We looked at it in the England as well. I think last lecture we discussed that about England. But failed in the Latin countries like Italy, France, and Spain. It was an urban phenomenon and flourished where local magistrates supported it. So John Calvin, particularly, he was in the period 1509 to 1564, a French lawyer and theologian, was responsible for the success of the Reformation outside Germany and Scandinavia. He created the patterns of thought that have dominated Western culture throughout the modern era. American culture in particular, it is thoroughly Calvinist, particularly the American initial days when the nation was formed, it was thoroughly Calvinist. Let's look at his conversion and reform, John Calvin. Somewhere in the period 1532 to 1534, Calvin experienced a sudden conversion which he never discussed publicly. Originally a lawyer and not a humanist, he turned to theology and dedicated himself to reforming the church. He began to spread his theological beliefs, and within a year, he and his friends were in trouble with the authorities, both civil and ecclesiastical. Highly learned man. By the way, he was a humanist. He turned to God. There was no particular incident mentioned, but he had that experience with Christ. Institutes of the Christian religion. I think I have posted this masterpiece in our group. When you have free time, you start reading this. John Calvin has written this, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536, hoping to convince King France, one, that Protestantism posed no threat to his rule. However, the treatise did not have the intended result, and Calvin was forced to leave France. He tried to defend his faith. He tried to explain the king that the Protestant ideas are not threat to the kingdom. Without the king's approval and without the king's support, it is very difficult for the church to survive. We have seen in other classes how the state and the church struggle through the issues. So Calvin emphasized the power of God. If you look at his theology, Calvin emphasized the power of God over sinful and corrupt humanity. Calvin's God demanded obedience. When I say Calvin's God, it's not a Calvin's God or your God or my God. It is the God of the Bible. But in the context of theology, we talk about these kind of terminologies. Calvin's God demands obedience, means the Calvin's understanding of God. In other sense, Calvin demanded obedience. The distance between God and man was bridged only by Christ. Very theologically sound theology there. Calvin's theology was stern. God's love must be rigorously obeyed, no question of disobeying. Social and moral righteousness must be earnestly pursued. Political life must be carefully regulated. Human emotions must be strictly controlled. Human emotions must be strictly controlled. This is about Calvin's understanding of God. His most theology is very much phrased as predestination. We have discussed the length and breadth in our theology course, systematic theology course. Let me explain. Calvin explained salvation in terms of predestination. God grants grace for his own mysterious reasons and knows in advance who will be saved and who will be condemned to hell. Although people are predestined to salvation or damnation, they can never know their fate with certainty. Nevertheless, Calvinism offered the saint, means is the truly predestined human and man and women, a sense of self-assurance and righteousness that transformed them. Self-assurance and righteousness that transformed them. I'm not explaining what is predestination and this and that. That's the theology class we have already discussed. We are discussing about his theology and his contribution. Dedication to God's law, signs of salvation. Calvinists assume that only unfailing dedication to God's law could be seen as a sign of salvation. So Calvinism made for stern men and women active in their congregations and willing to suppress evil in themselves and others. Now, Calvinists are very much focused on holiness. A lot of the holiness movements have evolved from this Calvinism. The goal is to suppress the evil in themselves and others. Revolutionaries' right to revolt. Calvinism could also produce revolutionaries willing to defy any temporal authorities perceived to be in violation of God's laws. For Calvinists, obedience to Christian law became the dominating principle of life. If I ask you what is the dominating principle of your life, you may say 101, but Calvinists say obedience to Christian law. In another sense, obedience to the Word of God is the primary goal of the individual. Let's look at Geneva Theocracy. Theocracy means the rule of God. Calvin finally sought a refuge in Geneva because he had to move away from the country because King refused his stay there because this revolutionary ideas of Protestant ideas may bring trouble to his kingdom. That's the reason he didn't allow him. He had to get away from the country. There he eventually established a Protestant church where in Geneva. A small, prosperous Swiss city near the French border. There, Calvin, he established Protestant first church there. and closely regulated the citizens' personal and social lives. Elders of the Calvinist Church governed the city and imposed strict discipline in dress. Since then, the Roman Catholicism allowed people to have a kind of loose life, but here Calvin established the first Protestant church in that part of the world at Geneva. So the elders of the Calvinist church governed the city and imposed strict discipline, and even in the dress code, very much strict. Sexual morals, church attendance, and business affairs. Dress code, sexual morals, church attendance, and business affairs. So the entire life was very much Christ-centered and Bible-based. Obedience was demanded. So much to learn from them. Much to learn from them. And today, if you look at today's context, dress no matter, free worship. We call it as a free worship, free life. Whatever the dress you wear. And particularly the more uncovering, the more culture. And sexual morals, no, who cares? And the church attendance, who cares? Business affairs, by hook or crook, we need to get more money. So we had a very good course on situational ethics, the biblical ethics course. We went through the whole month. I don't want to discuss much on that. That's the reason these reformers, they brought a great revolutionary change in society based on the biblical values. They severely punished irreligious and sinful behavior. But today, if somebody emphasizes on this irreligious and sinful behavior, they are persecuted. It is becoming ulta. Today's church, you talk about sinful behavior in the church, they'll persecute you. They'll kick you away from the church. They'll kick you away from the church. Irreligious. For example, Calvin condemned the anti-Trinitarian views of Michael Servetus. And the episode ended in the notorious trial and burning in Servetus in 1553. Strict discipline. Of course, that much strict discipline may not be required today. So we may not require that severe punishment, but at least some kind of exhortation, helping people to be regular in the church, being good, following the word of God, and being strict in spiritual life. Now, appeal to merchants. Prosperous merchants and small shopkeepers saw in Calvinism doctrines that justified the self-discipline they already exercised in their own lives and wished to impose on the unruly masses. They particularly approved of Calvin's economic views, for he saw nothing sinful in commercial activities, unlike many Catholic clergy. Catholic clergy hasn't encouraged business, but Calvinism encouraged people to engage in the business, but be ethical. Be in the business, but be ethical. Follow the ethical values of the Bible. But today, either this side or that side, many Christians say business is unethical, let's give it up. We hardly see any Christian succeeding in business. We need to be salt and light in every aspect of our social life. Appeal to merchants. He saw nothing sinful in commercial activities. It's biblical. There is nothing sinful in commercial activities. Lydia was a woman. She was very faithful. She gave shelter to Paul and she engaged in the mission of God along with the business. Center of international Protestantism, Geneva became the center of international Protestantism because of the Calvin's great contribution. Calvin trained a new generation of Protestant reformers of many nationalists who carried his message back to their homelands. Calvin's institutes became the leading textbook of the new theology. In the second half of the 16th century, Calvin's theology of predestination spread into France, England, and the Netherlands, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Even the Protestant theology entered into the strongholds of the Catholic Center Roman Empire. Let's look at his revolutionary ideology. Calvin always opposed any recourse to violence and supported the authority of magistrates. Yet, when monarchy became their persecutor, his followers felt compelled to resist. Compelled to resist. They were not pessimists. They're not pessimists. They're pacifists. Calvin's theologians became the first political theologians of modern times to public arguments for opposition to monarchy and eventually for political revolution. Political revolution. They engaged in the politics, they engaged in the business. In France and later in the Netherlands, Calvinism became a revolutionary ideology, complete with an underground organization composed of dedicated followers who challenged the monarchical authority. Even they engaged in the war. You know why America came into existence? Because the Calvinistic ideology. They went and conquered the land of United States, the American land. They thought it is India, Red Indians, the local Red Indians. They chased all of them and they conquered. He gave birth to Puritanism. A lot of indigenous movements, what all we see in India and different parts of the India, they are different sects of Puritanism. Like Bhakt Singh movement, a part of Puritan movement, all the way goes root back to this theological thought. Even in a lot of movements in India, what are even the Pentecostal movement, the people who give a lot of importance, the Layman's Evangelical Fellowship, all the people who give a lot of importance to the holiness, they all have the roots there. The Puritans means you need to be so pure in our private and public life. In the 17th century, the English version of Calvinism, I'm saying it, English version of Calvinism, known as Puritanism. It is nothing but a Calvinism, but they rephrased it as a Puritanism. The English when they conquered the American land, particularly the Puritans, they call themselves as the Puritans. They are the Calvinists. Performed the new same function. Thus, in certain circumstances, Calvinism possessed the moral force to undermine the claims of the monarchical state of the individual. When I had the fortunate time to spend a month in Yale University at New Haven in Connecticut State, in United States, I had the privilege of going and seeing a lot of these Puritan statues and places. Puritans particularly established the city New Haven in Connecticut. So they call settlers, the early settlers who migrated, these English people, their theology, their museums, still today, they teach us the volumes of their personal life and the public life and their spiritual life. And I had a good study on them. I really wondered the way that they committed the family and to public life and to their professional life. So the major contribution of this John Calvin